I remember years ago when I was a young man, I was boasting to an old bishop about how popular my school assemblies were and how everybody loved them. Quick as a flash, he replied to me, "Woe to you when all speak well of you." And I was totally stung by this rejoinder, and I didn't like it at all, but it silenced me, which was perhaps the intention, and it made me think, which was perhaps also the intention. And I came to realise quite how dependent I am on the good opinion of others. What joy it brings me when people think well of me and pay me nice compliments. Conversely, how crushed I am when it turns out that people don't think well of me, when they criticise me or think ill of me. Popularity is extremely important to me, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this respect. And we can see this human tendency at work in workplaces where the iniquitous business of constant performance review is often a way of providing concealed bullying so that people can feel bad about themselves even as they're being given what is apparently constructive, positive advice about how to do better. But this, of course, is a quote from the 6th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel. And to put it slightly more in context, woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets, so says Jesus. Matching it with a parallel text earlier on, blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. So what can I make of this text, and how can I try to apply it in my own life and perhaps become slightly less dependent on the good opinion of others? Well, first of all, I want to exclude a way in which this text might be inappropriately embraced. There are people, not many, but they are around, who are so cussed and spiky that they actually take pleasure in being unpopular, in irritating and annoying other people. And I think for people like this, obviously that text is welcome in all the wrong sorts of ways. But most people do love popularity. They want everybody to like them, and I don't think I'm alone in that respect. So what is Jesus talking about? Well, putting it in an even wider context of a series of blessings and curses, a rather surprising turnaround, Jesus starts with saying, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." And he contrasts that with, "Woe to you who are rich, because you have already received your consolation." And so he develops the thought. And it must have been very surprising and shocking to his first hearers, as it was to me, especially when it was quoted back to me by that wise old bishop. It follows, I suppose, a parallel from the Old Testament reading set for this Sunday, where Jeremiah makes a much more obvious point, but I think it's quite a telling one, where he talks about people who are blessed and people who are cursed. He says, "Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, and cursed are those who trust in their own strength and in other powers." And I think this requirement, this demand throughout the Bible that we should trust in God and in nothing and no one else is a very important one, and I think Jesus is building on this. The further context of this reading from Luke is also something which is very telling and very striking. Jesus has just been preaching to huge multitudes of people, not just preaching to them, preaching messages of challenge and hope, but also healing them, and healing them of all sorts of diseases, all sorts of afflictions, both physical and mental. And the NRSV translation talks about people who were troubled with unclean spirits. And I think the notion of being troubled is a very powerful one. A lot of the time we don't have some specific mental illness, and certainly proper demonic possession is very rare. But a lot of people, a lot of the time, are troubled by unhappiness, anxiety, and depression of all sorts. And Jesus is coming to bring healing. And he's bringing healing promiscuously, widely, not selectively to a chosen few. I think we can sometimes get a little distracted when we look at these healings as miraculous. Miraculous they undoubtedly were. I firmly believe that Jesus had very unusual powers which were known at the time and controversial at the time. But actually the essence of what he is doing, the healing, is something that anybody can do. You do not need miraculous powers to make people better. It is something that any doctor can do, any psychotherapist or any good friend or family member. But what Jesus is actually doing is not just randomly healing people. I think it's very important. This ties in with Luke's whole picture of Jesus. What he's doing is actually giving people a foretaste, a prefiguring of God's final healing and restoration of the entire world. It will come with the general resurrection of the dead, the so-called second coming. This event is prefigured by Jesus in his own resurrection, and I think this message does lie at the heart of the New Testament, as has recently been so cogently argued by N.T. Wright and other biblical commentators. So when Jesus is doing his work of healing and preaching and bringing health and restoration into people's lives, he is actually giving people a little glimpse of God's final healing work, of making the world as it was meant to be, as it was intended to be. And he does this, as I say, promiscuously. He doesn't select the chosen few. How can we put this sort of message, this powerful example, into practice in our own lives? Well, I think going back to the idea of wanting to be popular, let's look at some of the ills of the Christian churches, particularly in the West at the moment. Unfortunately, we've come to be seen as, at best, a harmless irrelevance, as we've perhaps been seen for many years now, but at worst a toxic brand, especially as a result of the abuse scandals which have been experienced in many churches. And there, of course, have been desperate attempts by the churches to turn the tide, to make ourselves popular again. But sometimes this can be rather desperate, much in the way of a high street retailer desperately trying to get people to return to former habits of shopping and retail behaviour, and losing their battle against a rising tide of alternative behaviours. Unfortunately, in the case of the church, people can find so many alternative forms of worthwhile activity and entertainment to perform on a Sunday, and going to church comes very far down the list. And in response to this, great programs of evangelization, of marketing the church as a successful institution, are put into practice. But I think all this is somehow missing the point, and I sometimes worry whether it will even be particularly successful. I would love it if it were, but I fear it may not be. So maybe we should put our emphasis as Christians in somewhere completely different. Instead of worrying about how to attract people to going to church on a Sunday again, we should ask ourselves what actually church is meant to be there for. Primarily, it seems to me, it is creating a sacred space in which people can witness, pray together, and also be opened to the channel of God's activity through preaching the word and through the sacraments. There isn't really anything else that a church building should be for. Apart from that, let's look at what Jesus actually did and what he called his followers to do after he had risen from the dead. And here we see something that is very, very simple, but very, very hard to put into practice. What does Jesus spend most of his time doing? Apart from preaching the word, which I've already covered, he spends his time bringing healing into people's lives, beginning the work of restoration, which Christians believe God will bring to completion. And we can do that very simply. We can bring healing into people's lives. We can bring love where there has been no love before. We can listen to people. We can show them the love that Jesus showed to all those people on that plain, that hillside in Galilee so many years ago. And I think if we do this, some interesting results will follow. And it is something that many Christians are already doing, of course. When we look at the ills of the church, we should not underestimate the wonderful work that many Christians do, following their Lord to bring about God's work of restoration. But I think if the emphasis of the church is far more on this work of restoration, this work of love and healing, two interesting things will follow. One is that when you genuinely love people, they will respond with gratitude and love in return. The church's popularity will increase the more it shows love. But also, as Jesus said, woe to you when all speak well of you, and blessed are you when people hate you and exclude you and revile you. One of the things about this resurrection hope which Jesus began was that it was turning the power relationships, the structure of society, on its head, because he was embracing with his love all those people who were marginalized and excluded from the society of his day, the ignored, the forgotten, the disabled, the sick, those troubled with mental illnesses, and those suffering from socially excluding diseases. And in doing that, he became a controversial figure. He became as much hated as he was loved, and it was that hatred that led to his death. But it was a hatred he had to embrace to do what he believed he'd been sent to do. To follow Jesus' example requires a huge act of trust. The trust in God, in God's purposes, and in nothing else called for by Jeremiah, and trust in the resurrection of the dead, prefigured by the resurrection of Jesus and promised to us all, triumphantly proclaimed by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And if we can hold on to this trust and not lose our nerve, we will be following Jesus indeed, and we will be able to bear, to sustain, and not be overwhelmed by the hatred of the world, should that be what we experience.